going to assume that you have accepted that there is a God and that you can know that God personally. The Bible claims that that God is both a God of love and a God of justice. And yet when we look at the world around us, we see so much injustice, and we can wonder, why is this God not doing something about it? And what's maybe worse is that the Bible then claims that this same God of love will judge us by how we have lived our lives. Now, I guess for many of us, that kind of God is deeply unattractive. We may think, what right does God have to judge me? We take issue with God on the basis that he doesn't know us and therefore has no authority or claim on our lives. And yet, were we to dig a little deeper, we'd find that none of those things are in fact true. Now, most of us would admit that there are authorities that have the right to judge us. For instance, the judge in a law court presiding over a criminal case, or the driving test examiner deciding whether we are fit to drive a car on our own or not. And in both cases, we listen to their judgments, we submit to their decision because we deem them to be suitably qualified to judge the case or our driving skills or something else that it may be. But when it comes to making a judgment on our lives in their entirety, there is only one who is uniquely qualified to do that. King David in the Old Testament poetically writes of God that your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. You see, in this psalm, David speaks of God as creator, as the God who can see the creation of our very bodies in a way that not even our best ultrasound scanners can. But David also speaks of God being the one who can see our days even before they have come to pass. And that's because this eternal, timeless God knows us and sees us. He knows our thoughts, our actions and our words. He sees our motives and our reasons and our hearts. He knows us. He really knows us. But how can this God love us and then judge us? I mean, judging us doesn't seem to be very loving, does it? But the assumption here is that love and justice cannot go together, that you cannot love someone and then judge them or punish them at the same time. But I don't think that's true. Many of us would have had that experience of being disciplined by our parents for something that we have done wrong. And whilst there are always exceptions to this, we would not take that to mean that because our parents have disciplined us and punished us, that they don't love us. Quite the opposite. The parent who disciplines their child for running across a busy road without even looking is arguably being more loving than the parent who sees their child doing that but yet ignores it. In the same way, surely it's more loving to the family of a husband who's been murdered to judge the killer accordingly rather than to leave that act unpunished. Now, of course, one of the difficulties we have is that our sense of justice is so often skewed by our own feelings and our own circumstances. The child holding a plate of biscuits whilst their sibling only has one and yet cries out, "It's still not fair!" It just reminds us that we're not always able to be impartial and to make those fair judgments ourselves. And yet, wonderfully, God's justice is not like that, because God can be completely loving and yet completely just at the same time. And we see that ultimately displayed when Jesus died on the cross. This is what the Apostle Paul wrote in his letter to the church in Rome. He says this: "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? You see, the cross is where God's love and God's justice came together. To a world who had rejected God as creator and king, he sent his son Jesus, who chose to be judged on the cross for our rejection of him and our actions towards one another. You see, not only was God uniquely qualified to judge us, but he was uniquely qualified to take the judgment that we deserved for the way that we have lived towards him and against one another. You see, in his love, he did that so that we could be saved, so that we could be declared not guilty before God, so that we could be set free to be in relationship with him forever. You see, if God were being just, we would all fall short of his perfect standards and we would deserve to be punished, and me just as much as anyone else. But because of his love, God was willing for that judgment that we deserved to fall on his perfect Son, Jesus, so that we could be saved. Now, one day we will see justice being done. One day every wrong will be fully and finally dealt with when Jesus returns to judge. But on that day, his loving judgment will fall on us too. So the question is, will we receive God's love? Will we let Jesus take the judgment we deserve from God? Or will we reject God's love and take the judgment and punishment we deserve ourselves?